The world did not end in a moment of chaos. It collapsed, step by step, decision by decision, until there was no way back. This is the account of what really happened in the days of Noah, based on the biblical record and the sequence of events it describes. Tonight, we will follow this story carefully and in order. We will examine the condition of humanity before the flood, the specific reasons given for the judgment, the life of Noah and why he was chosen, the construction of the ark, and the exact progression of events that led to one of the most decisive moments in early human history. This is not a symbolic retelling. We will stay close to the text, the timeline, and the consequences that unfolded. Many people know the flood as a simple story of destruction and survival. Few pay attention to the details that explain why it happened, how long it took to develop, and what warnings were given before everything changed. The biblical account describes a world that had reached a specific level of corruption and a sequence of decisions that made the outcome inevitable. How did an entire civilization reach that point without turning back? If you find this kind of step-by-step historical breakdown valuable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And before we continue, leave a comment. Where are you watching from? What time is it there right now? And in your view, what was a key reason humanity reached that level of corruption in Noah's time? Now, we begin at the point where the condition of the world first becomes clearly described. Act Uno, the world before the flood. The earliest description of the world in Noah's time does not begin with the flood itself, but with a gradual change in human behavior that unfolded over generations. According to the account in the book of Genesis, humanity had multiplied across the earth, forming communities, families, and early systems of life. This expansion, in itself, was not the problem. What the text emphasizes is what began to develop alongside that growth, a consistent pattern of moral decline that affected not just isolated individuals, but the direction of society as a whole. At this point in the timeline, the narrative introduces a detail that has been widely discussed and interpreted in different ways: the mention of the sons of God and the daughters of men. The text states that these unions produced offspring described as mighty men or men of renown. This mattered because it suggests a shift in the structure of human society, one where influence, power, and reputation became central. Some interpretations understand this as a mixing of distinct groups. Others see it as a reference to rulers or powerful figures consolidating control. Regardless of interpretation, the result described is clear: a society increasingly defined by dominance, reputation, and human ambition rather than restraint or accountability. As this condition developed, the narrative becomes more direct. It states that the wickedness of humanity had become great on the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually. This is not a casual observation, it is presented as a total assessment. The emphasis is on continuity, not occasional wrongdoing, but a sustained pattern where corruption had become normalized. This mattered because it indicates that the issue was not a single generation making isolated mistakes, but a system of behavior that had fully taken hold. Violence is identified as a central feature of this corruption. The text specifically says that the earth was filled with violence. In this context, violence does not refer only to physical conflict, but to a breakdown of order where force, exploitation, and harm became common tools in human interaction. This suggests a society where structures meant to maintain balance, whether social or moral, were no longer functioning. As a result, stability eroded, and conflict became a defining characteristic of daily life. Another important detail is how the narrative frames the perspective of God regarding this condition. It states that God saw the extent of human corruption, and that the earth was corrupt in his sight. This phrasing is significant because it introduces evaluation. The situation is not neutral or ambiguous, but measured and found to be fundamentally broken. The text goes further, stating that God was grieved in his heart. This is not presented as an impulsive reaction, but as a response to a long-developing reality. It implies that what was happening on the earth had reached a point where continuation without intervention was no longer possible. Atis states, "The narrative introduces a decision that defines everything that follows. God declares that he will put an end to all flesh, because the earth is filled with violence through them. This is presented as a conclusion drawn from observation, not a sudden act without context. The reasoning is directly connected to the conditions already described: widespread corruption, sustained violence, and the absence of corrective change. This mattered because it establishes the flood not as an arbitrary event, but as the outcome of a specific and escalating situation. However, the account does not present total destruction without exception. In the midst of this description, one individual is identified as different. Noah is introduced not through status or power, but through character. The text states that Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, and that he walked with God. This description is concise, but it carries weight. In a context where corruption is described as universal, Noah stands as an exception. This mattered because it creates the foundation for what happens next: the preservation of life through a single line of continuity. The introduction of Noah shifts the narrative from general condition to specific action. It signals that while the broader direction of humanity had reached a critical point, there was still a path forward through an individual who maintained a different way of living. This contrast between the state of the world and the character of Noah is essential to understanding the next phase of events. At this point, the situation is fully established: a world marked by widespread corruption and violence, a declared decision to bring that era to an end, and a single figure positioned as the starting point for what will come after. The next step is not immediate destruction, but instruction specific, detailed, and deliberate. The focus now shifts to what Noah was told to do, and how those instructions began to take shape in preparation for what was coming. Act 2. CT2, the instruction and the ark. The focus shifts from describing the condition of the world to outlining a specific set of instructions given to Noah. This transition is critical because it marks the movement from judgment being declared to preparation being initiated. According to the Genesis account, God does not leave the outcome undefined. Instead, he provides Noah with detailed and structured directives, indicating that what is about to happen will unfold in an organized and deliberate manner rather than as an uncontrolled event. The first instruction centers on the construction of the ark. Noah is told to build a vessel using gopher wood, a term that has been debated due to its unclear identification in modern terms. What matters in the context of the narrative is not the exact species of wood, but the fact that the material is specified. This indicates intentionality and precision in the instructions. The ark is not described as a symbolic refuge, but as a physical structure designed for survival under specific conditions. The text then outlines its dimensions: 300 cubits in length, 50 cubits in width, and 30 cubits in height. Based on commonly accepted measurements of a cubit, this would make the ark approximately 135 meters long, 22.5 meters wide, and 13.5 meters high. This mattered because it establishes the ark as a massive structure, far beyond the scale of ordinary building projects of that time. In addition to its size, the internal design of the ark is also specified. Noah is instructed to make rooms within it and to cover it inside and out with pitch. The use of pitch suggests a need for waterproofing, reinforcing the idea that the vessel is intended to endure prolonged exposure to water. The mention of multiple levels lower, second, and third indicates that the ark is to be organized for capacity and function, not simply constructed as a single open space. This level of detail shows that the instructions are not abstract, but engineered, addressing both structure and practicality. Another key feature is the inclusion of an opening, described as a window or a space for light, placed near the top of the ark. This detail is often overlooked, but it plays an important role. It suggests a controlled environment within the vessel, allowing for ventilation and minimal light without compromising structural integrity. Additionally, the ark is to have a single door placed in its side. This detail becomes significant later in the narrative, but at this stage, it emphasizes that access to the ark is limited and defined, not open or continuous. Following the structural instructions, the purpose of the ark is clearly stated. God tells Noah that he is about to bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which there is the breath of life. This is the first explicit mention of the mechanism of destruction. Water covering the earth. The wording connects directly back to the earlier description of widespread corruption and violence, reinforcing that this event is a response to those conditions. This mattered because it clarifies that the ark is not being built as a precaution for an uncertain event, but as preparation for a declared and inevitable outcome. At the same time, a distinction is made between destruction and preservation. God establishes a covenant with Noah, stating that Noah will enter the ark along with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. This is the first introduction of a preserved group. The inclusion of Noah's immediate family indicates that the continuation of human life will occur through a specific lineage. This is not presented as random survival, but as a controlled continuity. The concept of a covenant also introduces a formal agreement, suggesting that what follows is part of a broader framework rather than a one-time intervention. In addition to human survival, Noah is instructed to bring living creatures into the ark. The text specifies that he is to bring 2 of every kind, male and female, to keep them alive. This directive expands the scope of preservation beyond humanity to include animal life. The phrase "after their kind" indicates categorization, though it does not provide a detailed biological system as understood today. What is clear is that the ark is intended to function as a contained environment for sustaining multiple forms of life during the period of destruction. Food storage is also addressed. Noah is told to gather and store food that will be needed for both his family and the animals. This detail reinforces the practical nature of the preparation. The event is not described as brief or instantaneous, but as something that will require sustained survival over time. The need for provisions indicates duration, planning, and the anticipation of conditions where external resources will not be available. The final statement in this section is concise but significant. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. This response is presented without elaboration, but it carries important implications. It indicates compliance without recorded resistance or delay. In the context of the narrative, this obedience sets Noah apart, not just in character, but in action. While the broader society is described as continuously corrupt, Noah follows precise instructions that directly counter the trajectory of his environment. At these stages, the preparation has been defined, but not yet completed. The instructions have been given in full, outlining the structure of the ark, the scope of preservation, and the nature of the coming event. The next phase will move from instruction to execution, focusing on how these directives were carried out and what began to unfold as the ark took shape. With the instructions established, the narrative moves into the execution phase, where the focus is no longer on what should be done, but on what actually began to happen. This transition is essential because it tests the feasibility of everything previously described. Building a structure of that scale, organizing provisions, and preparing for an event that had never been experienced before would require time, consistency, and sustained effort. The text does not provide a detailed construction timeline, but it implies a prolonged period during which Noah worked in alignment with the instructions he had received. One of the key contextual elements during this phase is the lifespan of Noah. The account notes that Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters came upon the earth. This detail matters because it suggests that the period of preparation may have extended over decades, in a world where lifespans were significantly longer than what is common today. Large-scale projects could be undertaken over extended periods without the same limitations faced in later historical contexts. This does not reduce the difficulty of the task, but it frames it within a timeline where such an undertaking becomes more structurally plausible. During this period, Noah's actions would have been visible. The construction of an ark of this size could not occur in isolation or secrecy. It would have required space, materials, and continuous labor. This implies that others in the surrounding area would have been aware of what was taking place. While the text does not describe their reactions in detail, the absence of recorded support or participation suggests that Noah's work was not widely accepted or understood. This matters because it reinforces the earlier description of a society that had already moved in a different direction. one that did not align with the warning implied by Noah's actions. The logistical aspects of construction also require attention. The use of gopher wood and pitch indicates that specific resources needed to be gathered and processed. This would involve locating suitable materials, transporting them, and applying them in a way that ensured structural integrity. The ark's dimensions required not only raw materials, but also a method of assembly that could support weight, resist pressure, and remain stable over time. Although the narrative does not describe tools or techniques, the successful completion of the ark implies that whatever methods were used were effective in achieving the intended design. As the construction progressed, the instructions regarding animals and provisions remained in place. At this stage, however, the gathering process had not yet fully begun. The text later clarifies that the animals would come to Noah rather than being individually captured by him. This distinction matters because it shifts the burden of collection away from human effort and toward a process that is described as directed or guided. It suggests that the preparation involved both human action building and storing and elements that would occur according to the timeline set by God. Another development introduced during this phase is a refinement of the earlier instruction regarding animals. While the initial directive mentions, "Bring in 2 of every kind," a later instruction specifies that clean animals are to be taken in groups of 7 pairs, while unclean animals remain in pairs of 2. This distinction is important because it introduces a categorization that will later relate to sacrificial practices. It indicates that the preservation plan was not only about survival, but also about maintaining a structure that would allow for continuity of specific practices after the flood. Food preparation becomes increasingly critical as the project approaches completion. The need to sustain both human life and a large number of animals over an undefined period requires significant storage. This implies that Noah had to anticipate quantities, preservation methods, and distribution within the ark. The inclusion of multiple levels in the ark's design would facilitate this organization, allowing for separation between species and allocation of space for supplies. This mattered because survival during the flood would depend not only on the ark's ability to float, but on its capacity to function as a stable, self-contained environment. As these preparations continued, the narrative introduces a final warning that defines the immediacy of what is about to occur. God tells Noah that in 7 days, he will cause it to rain upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and that every living substance will be destroyed from the face of the ground. This is the first time a specific time frame is given. The introduction of a 7-day period transforms the situation from long-term preparation to immediate readiness. It signals that the phase of building and gathering is coming to an end, and that the next stage will begin without delay. The specification of 40 days and 40 nights of rain also provides a measurable component to the event. It indicates that the flood will not be a brief occurrence, but a sustained process. This detail is important because it aligns with the need for extensive preparation and reinforces the scale of the event being described. It also sets expectations for what Noah and those with him will experience once inside the ark. Again, the response is summarized in a direct statement. Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. This repetition reinforces consistency in Noah's actions. State, receiving instructions, building the ark, preparing provisions. His role is defined by adherence rather than deviation. In contrast to the broader environment described earlier, where human behavior had become unpredictable and corrupt, Noah's actions remain aligned with a clear directive. At this point, the construction is complete, the provisions are gathered, and the final warning has been given. The remaining steps involve entering the ark and initiating the sequence of events that will lead to the flood itself. The transition from preparation to execution is now imminent, and the narrative moves toward the moment when the instructions are fully enacted, with the final warning delivered and the preparation phase completed. The narrative enters a critical transition point, the movement from readiness into action. The text specifies that Noah, along with his family, begins the process of entering the ark in direct response to the approaching event. This step is not described as rushed or chaotic, but as orderly and aligned with the instructions previously given. The timing matters here because it occurs within the 7-day period announced earlier, indicating that this window served as the final interval between warning and execution. Noah is described as entering the ark with his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth along with his wife and the wives of his sons. This detail reinforces the continuity plan that had been outlined earlier. The preservation of human life is limited to a single family unit, structured across generations. This mattered because it establishes a controlled restart point for humanity after the flood. There is no ambiguity about who is included. The group is defined clearly and remains consistent throughout the narrative. At the same time, the process involving the animals begins to unfold. The text describes how animals of every kind come to Noah, entering the ark in pairs, male and female, just as clean animals are included in greater numbers, consistent with the earlier refinement of the command. This movement is not described as driven by human effort or coordination, but as something that occurs in alignment with the directive already given. This matters because it emphasizes that the gathering of animals is not a logistical challenge solved by Noah alone, but part of the broader sequence of events being carried out. The orderliness of this process stands in contrast to what might be expected in a scenario involving such a large number of living creatures. There is no description of confusion or disorder. Instead, the focus remains on completion. All required individuals and animals enter the ark within the defined time frame. This reinforces the idea that the preparation phase was not only thorough but also effectively concluded. Once all have entered, a significant detail is introduced. The door of the ark is shut by God. This is not presented as an action taken by Noah or any member of his family. The closure of the door marks a definitive boundary between those inside and those outside. This mattered because it signifies the end of opportunity for entry. Up to this point, the narrative has allowed for preparation and response. With the closing of the door, that phase ends, and the consequences of prior conditions are set into motion. Following this, the narrative notes that the floodwaters begin after the 7-day period. The timing is precise. Noah is 600 years old, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, when the waters come upon the earth. This level of specificity is important because it anchors the event in a defined moment rather than a vague period. It suggests that the account is concerned with recording not just what happened, but when it happened in relation to the established timeline. The onset of the flood is described in 2 simultaneous actions. First, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up. Second, the windows of heaven were opened. These phrases indicate that the source of the water is both below and above. The fountains of the deep suggest subterranean or oceanic sources, while the windows of heaven refer to rainfall. This dual origin matters because it explains how the volume of water required to cover the earth could be generated. It is not a single source event, but a combined process that begins at the same time. Rain begins to fall upon the earth, continuing for 40 days and 40 nights. As previously stated, this marks the start of the sustained phase of the flood. The duration is significant because it aligns with the need for the ark to function as a long-term refuge. It also indicates that the conditions outside the ark deteriorate progressively rather than instantly. The rising water levels, combined with continuous rainfall, create an environment where survival outside the ark becomes increasingly impossible. Inside the ark, the situation is not described in detail, but certain implications can be drawn from the structure and preparation already outlined. The division into levels, the storage of food, and the separation of animals would all come into effect. During this period, stability within the ark would depend on the integrity of its construction and the organization of its contents. The earlier instructions regarding pitch and design now serve their purpose, as the ark must withstand constant exposure to water and movement. Outside, the narrative begins to describe the consequences. The waters increase and begin to lift the ark above the earth. This is a key transition point. The ark moves from being a stationary structure to a floating vessel. This shift matters because it confirms that the flood has reached a level where land is no longer a stable environment. The ark, by design, becomes the only viable place of survival. As the rain continues and the waters rise, the separation between inside and outside becomes absolute. Those within the ark are sustained by preparation and structure, while those outside are subject to the conditions that have now fully developed. The narrative does not dwell on individual experiences outside the ark, but the outcome is clearly stated. The flood begins to fulfill its purpose as described earlier. At these days, the process is underway but not yet complete. The waters are rising, the ark is afloat, and the duration of rainfall is ongoing. The next phase will focus on how the flood reaches its peak, what happens to the earth as a whole, and how long these conditions persist before any reversal begins. As the rainfall continues and the subterranean waters surge upward, the flood reaches a stage where its scale becomes fully apparent. The text describes the waters as prevailing upon the earth, a term that indicates not just presence, but dominance. This matters because it signals that the flood is no longer a developing event, has become the defining condition of the entire environment. The ark, which had already begun to float, is now carried by waters that are steadily rising beyond any remaining land structures. The description of the water levels becomes more precise as the narrative progresses. It states that the waters increased greatly upon the earth, and that all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The language here is comprehensive. It does not refer to a localized flood or a regional disaster, but to an event that extends across all known terrain. The text even specifies that the waters rose 15 cubits above the highest points, which would be sufficient to submerge elevated landforms completely. This mattered because it confirms that there were no natural refuges remaining outside the ark. Elevation, which might typically provide safety, was no longer a factor. As a result of these conditions, the consequences outlined earlier begin to fully take effect. The narrative states that all flesh that moved upon the earth perished: birds, livestock, wild animals, and all humanity outside the ark. The phrasing is deliberate and inclusive, reinforcing that the scope of the flood aligns with the earlier declaration to put an end to all flesh in which there was the breath of life. This is not described in emotional or dramatic terms, but as the direct outcome of the conditions that had been building. This mattered because it closes the loop between cause and effect. The widespread corruption and violence described in Act 1 lead to a consequence that is equally comprehensive. The ark remains the only exception to this outcome. It is described as floating on the surface of the waters, sustained by the very conditions that are destroying everything else. This contrast is central to understanding the role of the ark. It is not merely a vessel of survival, but a controlled environment that preserves life while the external world undergoes complete transformation. The earlier details regarding its construction, its size, its sealed structure, its internal organization now demonstrate their purpose. Each specification contributes to its ability to endure this phase. The duration of the floodwaters at their peak is also addressed. The text states that the waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. This extends far beyond the initial 40 days and nights of rain. The distinction matters because it shows that the flood consists of multiple phases. An initial period of active rainfall, followed by a prolonged period where water levels remain elevated. During this time, the ark continues to drift, with no indication of direction or destination. The absence of land means there are no reference points, and the vessel exists entirely within the new, water-covered environment. Inside the ark, survival depends on the continuity of the systems established during preparation. Food supplies, spatial organization, and the separation of animals all contribute to maintaining order. While the narrative does not describe daily life within the ark in detail, the fact that all occupants remain alive through this extended period indicates that the preparation was sufficient. This reinforces the importance of the earlier instructions and Noah's adherence to them. Without that level of precision, survival over 150 days would not be possible. Another important aspect of this phase is the absence of further instruction during the peak of the flood. After the ark is sealed and the waters rise, the narrative becomes observational rather than directive. This matters because it suggests that the time for action has passed, and what remains is the unfolding of conditions already set in motion. The focus is no longer on decisions, but on endurance. The ark continues to exist within the flood, sustained by its design and the provisions within it. At the same time, the narrative introduces a subtle but significant shift that prepares for what comes next. After describing the full extent of the flood and its duration, the text states that God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark. This statement does not imply that Noah had been forgotten, but rather marks a transition point. It signals that the phase of judgment has reached its limit, and that a new phase one of reduction and restoration is about to begin. This moment matters because it bridges the destructive phase of the flood with the process that will eventually lead to the reappearance of land and the reestablishment of life. Outside the ark, it introduces the idea that the same authority that initiated the flood will also bring it to an end. The narrative is moving from dominance of water to the beginning of its withdrawal. At this point, the flood has achieved its full extent. The earth is entirely covered. All external life has been removed, and the ark remains as the sole container of surviving life. The next phase will focus on how the waters begin to recede, how long that process takes, and how Noah and those with him respond as the environment gradually changes. Act 3. The waters begin to recede. The transition from peak flood conditions to the beginning of recession is marked by a deliberate shift in the narrative. After 150 days of prevailing waters, the text introduces a change that is not sudden, but controlled. It states that God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters began to subside. This detail matters because it identifies the mechanism of change. Just as the flood began through coordinated sources, rain from above and waters from below, the recession also follows a process, not an instant reversal. The introduction of wind suggests evaporation, movement, and redistribution, indicating that the environment is starting to stabilize. At the same time, the sources that contributed to the flood are described as being restrained. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven are said to be stopped, and the rain from heaven is restrained. This matters because it marks the end of active input. No new water is being added to the system. From this point forward, the total volume of water begins to decrease, not because of a single event, but because the inflow has ceased, and the existing water is being gradually reduced. This establishes a second phase of the flood timeline, defined by decline rather than increase. The movement of the ark during this period is also addressed. After the waters begin to recede, the ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month. This detail is precise and significant. It indicates that while the waters are still present, their level has decreased enough to allow the ark to make contact with elevated terrain. However, the fact that only the ark rests, while the surrounding landscape remains submerged, suggests that this is an early stage in the recession process. Land is not yet visible, and the environment outside remains largely unchanged from the perspective of those inside the ark. The mention of the mountains of Ararat introduces a geographical anchor into the narrative, while the exact location has been interpreted in different ways. The reference establishes that the ark's journey has reached a defined endpoint in terms of movement. This matters because it transitions the ark from a drifting vessel to a stationary structure once again. The change from floating to resting indicates progress, even though conditions outside are still not suitable for exit. As time continues, the text notes that the waters decrease continually until the 10th month. On the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains become visible. This is a key milestone in the sequence. For the first time since the flood began, visible land emerges above the waterline. This matters because it provides the first external confirmation that the environment is changing in a meaningful way. However, the delay between the ark coming to rest and the appearance of mountaintops indicates that the process is gradual. The recession of water is measured in months, not days. Inside the ark, these changes would not be immediately apparent in detail. The structure is enclosed with limited openings and designed primarily for survival rather than observation. However, the shift from continuous movement to a stable position would be noticeable. The cessation of constant motion, combined with the passage of time, would indicate that conditions outside are no longer intensifying. This aligns with the earlier statement that the sources of water have been restrained. At this stage, Noah does not immediately leave the ark. Instead, the narrative emphasizes waiting. Even after the tops of the mountains are visible, there is no instruction given to exit. This matters because it reinforces a pattern seen earlier. Action occurs in response to clear direction, not assumption. Noah's role continues to be defined by adherence to timing, rather than initiative taken independently of instruction. After 40 days from the point when the mountaintops become visible, Noah initiates a specific action. He opens the window of the ark and sends out a raven. The choice of a raven is notable because it is a bird capable of surviving in a wide range of conditions. The text states that the raven goes to and fro until the waters are dried up from the earth. This suggests that while land may be emerging, it is not yet stable or suitable for habitation. The raven's behavior indicates ongoing fluctuation, with no clear resting place established. Following this, Noah sends out a dove to see if the waters have subsided from the face of the ground. The dove, unlike the raven, is more dependent on stable conditions. When it finds no place to rest, it returns to the ark. This matters because it provides a more precise indicator of the environment's condition. While the raven could continue moving without settling, the dove's inability to find rest suggests that the ground is still largely covered or unstable. Noah waits another 7 days and sends the dove out again. This time, the dove returns in the evening with an olive leaf in its mouth. This detail is significant because it confirms not only that land is exposed, but that vegetation is beginning to reappear. The presence of an olive leaf indicates that plant life has survived or is regenerating, providing a clear sign that the environment is moving toward habitability. This mattered because it gives Noah a measurable indication that the floodwaters are no longer dominating the landscape. He waits another 7 days and sends the dove out again. This time, the dove does not return. The absence of the dove indicates that it has found a place to settle, suggesting that conditions outside have reached a level where sustained life is possible. This marks a critical turning point. For the first time since entering the ark, there is evidence that the external environment can support independent survival. Despite this, Noah still does not immediately exit the ark. The narrative emphasizes that even with these indicators, the final step requires confirmation beyond observation. The sequence of sending birds, waiting periods, and gradual signs of change illustrates a controlled approach to re-entry into the world. At this point, the waters have receded significantly. Land is visible, vegetation is returning, and animal life can begin to sustain itself outside the ark. The next phase will address the exact moment when Noah receives instruction to leave, how the exit is carried out, and what the first actions are upon returning to the earth. After the dove fails to return, the narrative reaches a point where external conditions have clearly changed, but the process is still not complete. The absence of the dove indicates that stable ground exists somewhere beyond the ark, yet Noah does not act immediately. This matters because it reinforces a consistent pattern throughout the account. Observation alone is not the final authority for action. Even with visible evidence and repeated testing, Noah continues to wait for confirmation before making a decisive move. The timeline continues with another precise marker. In the 601st year of Noah's life, in the first month, on the first day of the month, the waters are described as dried from the surface of the ground. This does not mean the earth is fully restored, but it indicates that standing water is no longer covering the land in the same way. This distinction matters because it separates two stages: the disappearance of floodwaters from the surface and the complete drying of the ground beneath. At this point, Noah removes the covering of the ark and looks outward. This is the first time the text describes a direct visual confirmation from Noah himself. Up until now, information about the outside world has been indirect, obtained through the behavior of birds. Now, Noah observes that the surface of the ground is no longer submerged. This action marks a shift from indirect testing to direct inspection. But still, no immediate exit occurs. The delay continues until a second confirmation is reached. In the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth is described as completely dry. This detail is important because it shows that even after the visible waters recede, additional time is required for the land to stabilize. The gap between the first visible drying and the complete dryness of the earth spans several weeks. This matters because it demonstrates that the recovery process is gradual, not instantaneous, and that premature action could lead to failure. Only after this full period does a new instruction appear. God speaks to Noah again, telling him to go out of the ark, along with his family and all living creatures. This is the first directive given since the flood began, and it signals that the period of confinement is officially over. The timing of this command confirms that the waiting was necessary, not excessive. It aligns with the full restoration of environmental conditions required for life to resume outside. The instruction also includes a specific directive regarding the animals. They are to be brought out so that they may multiply upon the earth, be fruitful, and increase in number. This matters because it reconnects the narrative to the original purpose of life before the flood. The preservation within the ark was not the final. Galit was a temporary phase to ensure continuity. Now, that continuity is meant to expand again across the earth. At this stage, everything that had been contained is about to be released back into the world. The flood has ended, the land is stable, and the conditions for life have been restored. The next phase will focus on what happens immediately after leaving the ark, and how Noah responds once he steps onto dry ground again. With the command given, the narrative moves into the moment that had been anticipated since the ark was first constructed. The exit. Noah, his family, and all living creatures begin to leave the ark in an orderly manner. The text emphasizes sequence and structure rather than urgency. Each category of life, humans, livestock, birds, and creeping things, comes out according to its kind. This matters because it reflects continuity with the earlier instructions. The same order that governed entry into the ark now governs exit, reinforcing that the entire process, from preparation to release, follows a consistent framework. The duration of time spent inside the ark adds weight to this moment. From the beginning of the flood to the point of exit, more than a year has passed. This extended confinement is significant because it transforms the ark from a temporary refuge into a sustained living environment. Leaving it is not simply stepping outside, it is transitioning from a controlled, enclosed system back into an open and uncertain world. This matters because the conditions outside, although stabilized, are fundamentally different from what existed before the flood. On say outside the narrative records, Noah's first action, he builds an altar. This detail appears immediately after the exit, without mention of exploration, construction of shelter, or attempts to re-establish daily life. This matters because it establishes priority. The first recorded response to survival is not logistical, but intentional. Noah takes some of every clean animal and bird and offers burnt offerings on the altar. The earlier distinction between clean and unclean animals now becomes relevant. The presence of additional clean animals ensured that this act could take place without eliminating the capacity for reproduction within those species. The act of offering is described in terms of its effect. The text states that the offering produces a pleasing aroma, and this leads to a declaration from God. He states that he will never again curse the ground because of man, even though the inclination of the human heart is acknowledged as unchanged. This matters because it introduces a shift in approach. While the earlier judgment was based on widespread corruption, the post-flood response recognizes that human nature itself has not been fundamentally altered. The solution, therefore, is not another reset through destruction, but a different form of ongoing management. Another statement follows that reinforces stability moving forward. It declares that as long as the earth remains, cycles such as seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night will not cease. This matters because it establishes predictable patterns in the natural world. After a period defined by total disruption, the restoration includes consistency. These cycles become the framework within which life can rebuild and expand. At this stage, the narrative has moved from survival to reestablishment. The ark is no longer the center of life. The earth itself resumes that role. However, the conditions under which life will continue are now defined by what has just occurred. The flood is not presented as an isolated event, but as a turning point that shapes everything that follows. The presence of Noah's family as the only surviving human line also becomes central. All future generations will originate from this group. This matters because it connects the post-flood world directly to the events that have just taken place. The memory of the flood, the conditions that led to it, and the outcome it produced become part of the foundation for everything that comes next. At this point, life has resumed on the earth, but the structure of that life is about to be formally defined. The next phase introduces specific instructions and a covenant that will govern the relationship between humanity, the natural world, and God moving forward. After Noah's offering and the declaration that follows, the narrative moves into a phase where the restored world begins to receive structure. Up to this point, the focus has been on survival and transition, entering the ark, enduring the flood, and exiting into a changed environment. Now, the emphasis shifts toward establishing how life will function moving forward. This matters because the post-flood world is not simply a return to previous conditions. It is a reset that includes new directives and clarified boundaries. God speaks directly to Noah and his sons, introducing instructions that are both familiar and expanded. To command to be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth reappears, echoing the original mandate given at the beginning of human history. This continuity matters because it confirms that the fundamental purpose of human life expansion and stewardship remains in place. However, the context is now different. Humanity is restarting from a single family, and the memory of the flood becomes part of that foundation. A new element is introduced regarding the relationship between humans and animals. The text states that the fear and dread of humanity will fall upon every living creature. This marks a shift from the earlier description of coexistence. Now, animals are positioned in a relationship where they instinctively avoid human presence. This matters because it reflects a change in the balance between species. The natural world is no longer described as neutral in relation to humanity, but as responsive in a way that creates distance and hierarchy. Dietary instruction is also expanded. Humanity is now permitted to eat animals, with the condition that they do not consume blood, which is described as containing life. This is a significant development because it introduces both permission and restriction at the same time. The allowance of animal consumption provides a practical means of sustenance in a world that has just undergone environmental disruption. The restriction regarding blood establishes a boundary, indicating that even within this permission, there are limits that must be observed. This mattered because it sets a precedent for regulated behavior rather than unrestricted use of resources. Another critical directive concerns human life itself. The text states that whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. This introduces a principle of accountability tied directly to violence. Earlier in the narrative, widespread violence was identified as a central reason for the flood. Now, a framework is established to address that issue moving forward. This matters because it shows that the post-flood world includes mechanisms intended to prevent the same level of unchecked corruption from developing again. Following these instructions, the narrative introduces a formal covenant. God declares that he establishes a covenant with Noah, his descendants, and every living creature. The scope of this covenant is broad, extending beyond humanity to include all forms of life preserved through the flood. The central promise is clear. Never again will all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. This matters because it provides a guarantee that the type of global event just experienced will not be repeated. A visible sign is associated with this covenant, the rainbow. It is described as being set in the clouds as a reminder of the agreement between God and the earth. The significance of this sign is twofold. First, it serves as a recurring visual marker that appears under specific conditions, making it observable across generations. Second, it connects directly to the mechanism of the flood rain and clouds, transforming what was once associated with destruction into a sign of restraint. This mattered because it embeds the memory of the flood into a natural phenomenon that continues to occur. At this stage, the structure of the post-flood world is established. Humanity has a directive to multiply, a defined relationship with the animal world, guidelines for sustenance, and a framework for accountability. Above all, there is a covenant that defines the limits of future judgment by flood. The environment is stable, the population is positioned to expand, and the conditions for continuity are in place. The next phase will examine how this new beginning develops over time, including the immediate actions of Noah's family, the reestablishment of human society, and the events that follow as the population begins to grow again. Act 4. Life after the flood begins. With a covenant established and the immediate post-flood instructions given. The narrative moves into the first phase of human life on a restored Earth. This stage is defined not by survival, but by reorganization. Noah and his sons Shem, Ham and Japheth become the starting point for all future human populations. This matters because the entire structure of post-flood society will develop from a single family unit, making early decisions and behaviors especially influential in shaping what follows. The text begins by identifying the sons of Noah as the ones through whom the whole earth will be populated. This is not presented as a gradual or uncertain possibility, but as a direct outcome of the command to multiply. The emphasis on lineage establishes a framework for tracking how different groups emerge over time. It also connects future developments directly back to this moment, reinforcing that the post-flood world is not disconnected from what came before, but as a continuation under new conditions. At this point, Noah is described as a man of the soil who begins to plant a vineyard. This detail is important because it marks the return to agricultural activity. Before the flood, cultivation and settlement were already part of human life. Now, those practices are reintroduced. Planting a vineyard suggests both stability and forward planning, as vineyards require time to grow and produce. This matters because it indicates that Noah is not acting with short-term survival in mind, but with an expectation of ongoing life and development. However, the narrative quickly introduces an event that complicates this early stage. Noah drinks from the wine produced by the vineyard and becomes intoxicated, eventually lying uncovered within his tent. This moment is significant because it presents the first recorded incident of personal failure after the flood. It matters because it demonstrates that, despite the reset of the environment and the covenant established, human behavior remains subject to error and lack of control. The earlier statement that the inclination of the human heart persists is now illustrated through action. The response to this situation involves Noah's sons and introduces a contrast in behavior. Ham, the father of Canaan, sees his father uncovered and tells his two brothers outside. The text does not elaborate on his intent, but the act of exposing the situation rather than addressing it directly becomes the focus. In contrast, Shem and Japheth take a garment, walk backward into the tent, and cover their father without looking at him. This matters because it highlights a difference in response. One action exposes, while the other preserves dignity. When Noah awakens and becomes aware of what has occurred, he responds with a series of statements directed at his sons. He pronounces a curse on Canaan, the son of Ham, and blessings on Shem and Japheth. This outcome is important because it introduces long-term consequences tied to a single event. The narrative does not present this as an isolated reaction, but as something that affects future generations. This matters because it reinforces a pattern seen earlier in the story. Actions, even at an individual level, produce outcomes that extend beyond the immediate moment. Following this episode, the text notes that Noah lives for 350 years after the flood, reaching a total age of 950 years. This detail serves as a closing point for Noah's personal timeline. It matters because it provides continuity between the pre-flood and post-flood eras through a single individual who experienced both. Noah becomes a direct link between two distinct phases of human history. At these stages, the population is still limited to Noah's family, but the framework for expansion is in place. The next phase will detail how the descendants of Noah spread across the earth, how different groups are formed, and how the early structure of nations begins to take shape. Following the events within Noah's family, the narrative expands outward to describe how human population begins to spread across the earth. This section is often referred to as the Table of Nations, and it provides a structured account of the descendants of Noah's three sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This matters because it establishes the foundation for understanding how different regions, peoples, and early cultures emerge from a single point of origin after the flood. The text begins with Japheth, listing his sons and the regions associated with them. These descendants are described as spreading into coastal areas and forming distinct groups identified by their lands, languages, clans, and nations. The inclusion of geographic references is significant because it connects the narrative to real-world locations. While exact identifications vary among interpretations, the structure itself shows an organized expansion rather than random dispersion. This matters because it indicates that the repopulation of the Earth follows identifiable patterns, with groups settling in specific territories and developing distinct identities. The focus then shifts to the descendants of Ham, which includes several figures associated with regions in Africa and parts of the Near East. Among these descendants, Nimrod is introduced as a notable individual. He is described as a mighty man on the earth and a powerful hunter. The text also states that the beginning of his kingdom included cities such as Babel, Erech, and Akkad in the land of Shinar. This matters because Nimrod represents one of the earliest examples of centralized power and organized rule after the flood. His role suggests a shift from family-based groups to more structured societies, with defined leadership and urban development. The mention of cities is particularly important. It indicates that within a relatively short period after the flood, human populations begin to organize into settled communities, rather than remaining solely nomadic. The development of cities implies coordination, resource management, and the establishment of social systems. This matters because it shows that the rebuilding process is not slow or disorganized, but progresses toward complexity in a structured way. Next, the narrative details the descendants of Shem, who are associated with regions that later become central to the biblical storyline. This lineage is important because it leads toward the line that will eventually include figures such as Abraham. The emphasis on Shem's descendants highlights continuity in a specific direction, suggesting that while all humanity spreads from Noah's family, certain lines will carry particular significance in the unfolding narrative. Throughout this section, a repeated pattern appears. Names are listed alongside their descendants, followed by references to lands, languages, clans, and nations. This repetition matters because it establishes a clear structure for how human society develops. It shows that expansion involves both biological growth through family lines and cultural differentiation through language and territory. The presence of multiple languages at this stage is noted, but not yet explained. This detail becomes important in the next phase of the narrative. The overall result of this expansion is summarized clearly. From these descendants, the nations spread out over the earth after the flood. This statement reinforces the idea that the repopulation is comprehensive and successful. Humanity is no longer confined to a single location, but distributed across different regions, forming the early structure of what will become the known world. However, while the spread of nations appears organized, the narrative soon introduces a development that interrupts this process. The existence of multiple languages and separated groups raises a question. How did this division occur if humanity began from a single family? The answer to that question leads directly into the next major event, which will explain the origin of linguistic and cultural fragmentation. At these days, the world is populated again. Cities are forming. Leadership structures are emerging, and distinct groups are taking shape. The next phase will examine a specific event that affects all of humanity at once, altering the direction of this expansion and redefining how societies interact with one another. At this stage in the narrative, the expansion of humanity appears structured and progressive, but a critical detail is introduced that reframes the situation. The text states that the whole earth had one language and the same words. This matters because it indicates that despite the formation of different groups and regions described earlier, there was still a unified system of communication. This level of linguistic unity would allow for coordination on a large scale, enabling people from different families and regions to act together without barriers. As people move eastward, they find a plain in the land of Shinar and settle there. This decision is important because it marks a shift from dispersion to concentration. Instead of continuing to spread out across the earth, a significant portion of the population chooses to remain in one location. This matters because it directly contrasts with the earlier command to fill the earth. The choice to settle in one place sets the stage for what follows. The narrative then describes a coordinated effort among the people. They begin to make bricks and use bitumen for mortar, developing a method of construction that allows for durable building. This detail is significant because it reflects technological adaptation. Instead of relying on natural stone, They produce uniform materials, which enables larger and more consistent structures. This matters because it supports the scale of the project they are about to undertake. The project itself is clearly stated. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. This statement reveals both the goal and the motivation. The construction of the city and tower is not simply for shelter or organization. It is driven by a desire for recognition and control over their own distribution. This matters because it directly opposes the earlier directive to spread across the earth. The intent is to remain unified in one place and establish identity through a centralized achievement. The tower, often referred to as the Tower of Babel, represents more than a physical structure. It symbolizes a coordinated human effort to reach beyond natural limits and secure a form of permanence through construction and reputation. The phrase, "make a name for ourselves," indicates that the project is tied to legacy and influence. This matters because it reflects a pattern seen before the flood, where human ambition and self-definition begin to take precedence over alignment with the established order. In response to this development, the narrative shifts perspective to describe God observing what is taking place. It is stated that he comes down to see the city and the tower that the children of man have built. This phrasing emphasizes evaluation, similar to earlier points in the narrative where human actions are assessed. The conclusion drawn is that as one people with one language, they have the capacity to carry out their plans without limitation. This matters because it identifies unity, in this context, as a factor that enables unchecked action. The response is immediate and targeted. God confuses their language so that they cannot understand one another's speech. This action directly addresses the condition that made the project possible. By disrupting communication, coordination becomes impossible. This matters because it does not destroy the people or the city outright, but removes the mechanism that allowed the project to continue. As a result, the building effort stops. Following this, the people are dispersed over the face of the earth, and they cease building the city. The location is called Babel because it is there that the language of the whole earth is confused. This event provides the explanation for the linguistic diversity mentioned earlier in the Table of Nations. It also reintroduces dispersion, aligning the outcome with the original directive to fill the earth. At this point, humanity is no longer unified by a single language or centralized in one place. The spread across the earth continues, but now with distinct linguistic and cultural boundaries. The next phase will narrow the focus again, tracing a specific lineage that will become central to the continuation of the narrative. After the dispersion at Babel, the narrative shifts from a broad view of humanity to a focused lineage. This transition is important because it narrows the scope from all nations to a specific line that will carry forward the next phase of the account. The text begins tracing the descendants of Shem in a structured sequence, listing names, ages, and the progression from one generation to the next. This matters because it establishes continuity and provides a clear path from the post-flood world to a new central figure. The genealogy starts with Shem and moves through Arphaxad, Selah, Eber, and continues through several generations until it reaches a man named Terah. Each name is connected by lifespan and offspring, creating a chain that links the immediate aftermath of the flood to a later stage in human development. This structure is consistent with earlier genealogies, but here it serves a more focused purpose. It identifies the line through which future events will unfold, separating it from the broader population that is now spread across the earth. One notable detail in this lineage is the gradual reduction in lifespan compared to earlier generations. While individuals still live for many years, the numbers begin to decrease over time. This matters because it suggests a shift in human conditions after the flood. The exact cause is not explained in the text, but the pattern indicates that the post-flood environment differs in ways that affect longevity. This becomes a distinguishing characteristic of the generations that follow. The narrative then introduces Terah's family more directly. Terah has 3 sons: Abram, Nah, and Haran. This marks a transition from a list of names to a more detailed account involving specific individuals and their circumstances. Haran dies in the land of his birth, leaving behind a son named Lot. This detail matters because it introduces a relationship that will become significant later. Abram, who will later be known as Abraham, is presented as part of this family structure, though at this stage, no major actions are attributed to him yet. Another important detail is the mention of Sarai, Abram's wife, who is described as barren, having no child. This information is included early, before any further development, and it matters because it introduces a condition that will influence future events. In a narrative where lineage and continuation are central themes, the inability to have children presents a clear obstacle. This sets up a tension that will carry into the next phase of the story. The movement of Terah's family is also recorded. They leave Ur of the Chaldeans with the intention of going to the land of Canaan, but they settle in Haran instead. This partial migration is significant because it shows a shift in direction before reaching the intended destination. The reasons for stopping are not explained, but the result is that the family remains in Haran for a period of time. This matters because it becomes the setting for the next transition in the narrative. Terah eventually dies in Haran, marking the end of his role in the lineage. This event serves as a turning point with Terah's death. The focus is prepared to shift fully onto Abram. The groundwork has been laid. The lineage is established. Key relationships are introduced, and the geographical context is defined. At this stage, the narrative has moved from the global reset of the flood to the reestablishment of humanity, the division of nations, and finally to a single family line. The next phase will focus on Abram, introducing a new direction that builds on everything that has come before, but begins a distinct chapter with specific promises and movements that will shape the course of the story. A set-fied the call of Abram, and a new direction. With the lineage established and the setting defined in Haran, the narrative moves into a decisive turning point. The introduction of a direct instruction given to Abram. Up to this point, the account has followed broad developments: population growth, dispersion, and generational continuity. Now, the focus narrows to a single individual whose actions will shape the direction of future events. This matters because it marks a shift from general history to a targeted progression centered on one line. The instruction given to Abram is clear and specific. He is told to leave his country, his kindred, and his father's house, and go to a land that will be shown to him. This command involves separation on multiple levels: geographical, social, and familial. It requires Abram to move away from established structures and enter into an unknown destination. This matters because it introduces uncertainty as a necessary condition for what follows. The direction is given, but the details are not fully disclosed in advance. Alongside this instruction, a set of promises is outlined. Abram is told that he will become a great nation, that he will be blessed, and that his name will be made great. Additionally, it is stated that he will be a source of blessing to others, and that through him all families of the earth will be blessed. These statements define the purpose behind the command to leave. This matters because it connects Abram's personal movement to a broader outcome that extends beyond his immediate situation. The promise is not limited to his own life, but includes future generations and a wider impact. At this stage, the earlier detail regarding Sarai's barrenness becomes relevant. The promise of becoming a great nation stands in contrast to the current reality of having no child. This creates a clear tension between the present condition and the future outcome described. This matters because it establishes that the fulfillment of the promise will not occur through normal expectation alone. It introduces a gap that will need to be addressed as the narrative progresses. Abram's response is direct. The text states that he goes as he is told. There is no recorded delay or negotiation. He takes Sarai, his nephew Lot, and the possessions they have accumulated, and they begin the journey toward the land of Canaan. This matters because it continues the pattern seen earlier, with no action follows instruction without recorded resistance. The movement itself becomes the first step in the fulfillment of the promise. As Abram travels, the narrative provides geographical markers, indicating that he passes through specific locations until he reaches the land of Canaan. Upon arrival, another statement is introduced. The land is inhabited by the Canaanites. This detail matters because it clarifies that the destination is not empty or unclaimed. The promise of land is given in a context where others are already present, introducing a future layer of complexity. At this point, God appears to Abram and states that the land will be given to his offspring. This reinforces the earlier promise and adds a tangible element, a specific place tied to future descendants. Abram responds by building an altar, marking the location where the statement was made. This action is significant because it reflects acknowledgement and establishes a physical reminder of the encounter. Abram continues to move through the land, building another altar and calling upon the name of the Lord. These actions indicate a pattern of movement combined with recognition of the instructions and promises received. However, the narrative does not present immediate fulfillment. Instead, it shows the beginning of a process that will unfold over time. At this stage, Abram has left his original environment, entered a new land, and received confirmation of a promise that has not yet materialized. The next phase will examine the challenges that arise as Abram continues in this new direction, including external pressures and decisions that test the path he has begun to follow. Shortly after arriving in the land of Canaan, the narrative introduces a new challenge that disrupts the initial movement of Abram. A famine arises in the land, severe enough to make continued residence difficult. This matters because it creates immediate pressure on the promise Abram has just received. The land that was identified as part of his future is not, at this moment, capable of sustaining him and those with him. This tension between promise and present condition becomes a recurring pattern in the narrative. In response to the famine, Abram makes a decision to go down to Egypt, to sojourn there until conditions improve. This movement is not presented as a rejection of the earlier instruction, but as a practical response to a temporary crisis. Egypt, known for its consistent water supply due to the Nile, represents stability in contrast to the affected land of Canaan. This matters because it shows Abram navigating between trust in the promise and the need to address immediate survival. As Abram approaches Egypt, another concern emerges. He recognizes that Sarai's appearance may draw attention, and he anticipates that this could place him at risk. He instructs Sarai to say that she is his sister, explaining that this may protect him from harm. This decision is significant because it introduces a moment where Abram acts out of concern for his own safety, using a partial truth to manage the situation. This matters because it reflects the complexity of his character. He follows the initial instruction to leave, but in this moment, he takes control of circumstances through his own reasoning. Upon entering Egypt, the situation develops as Abram anticipated. Sarai is noticed for her appearance and is taken into the house of Pharaoh. As a result, Abram is treated well for her sake, receiving livestock, servants, and goods. This outcome appears beneficial on the surface, but it is built on a misrepresentation of their relationship. This matters because it sets up a consequence that extends beyond immediate gain. The narrative then records a corrective event. The Lord afflicts Pharaoh and his household with serious plagues because of Sarai. This intervention is direct and affects the entire household, not just Abram or Sarai. This matters because it reveals that the situation is not neutral. Even if it appears advantageous from a human perspective, the underlying issue is addressed through external action rather than Abram's own correction. Pharaoh responds by confronting Abram, questioning why he did not disclose that Sarai was his wife. The response is immediate. Pharaoh orders that Abram and all that belongs to him be sent away. This outcome resolves the situation, but it also exposes the instability created by Abram's earlier decision. While he leaves Egypt with increased possessions, the departure is not voluntary in the same way as his initial journey. This matters because it demonstrates that actions taken to manage risk can introduce new complications. Returning from Egypt, Abram goes back to the region between Bethel and Ai, where he had previously built an altar. This return is significant because it reestablishes continuity with the earlier stage of his journey. It indicates a movement back to the place associated with the original promise. Abram calls upon the name of the Lord there, reinforcing the pattern of acknowledgments seen before. At these states, Abram has experienced both progress and disruption. He has entered the land of Canaan, faced external pressure, made decisions that produced mixed outcomes, and returned to the point of initial confirmation. The promise remains in place, but the path forward is not without complexity. The next phase will introduce a situation involving Abram and Lot that requires a decision about land and separation, further shaping how the promise begins to take form in practical terms. After returning from Egypt and re-establishing himself near Bethel, Abram's situation begins to change due to growth in resources and people. Both Abram and his nephew Lot have accumulated livestock, servants, and possessions to the point where the land can no longer support them together. This matters because success itself creates a new problem. What had once been manageable as a single group now requires division in order to remain sustainable. The tension becomes visible through conflict between the herdsmen of Abram and the herdsmen of Lot. The land, already inhabited by Canaanites and parasites, cannot accommodate the increasing demand for grazing space. This detail matters because it shows that Abram is not operating in an empty environment. Resources are limited, and the presence of other groups adds pressure to the situation. The conflict is not abstracted, it's tied directly to land use and survival. Abram responds by addressing the issue directly with Lot. He proposes a separation to avoid further conflict, stating that it is better for them to divide peaceably than to allow disputes to continue. This matters because it reflects a decision to prioritize stability over control. Abram does not assert dominance over Lot, even though he is the elder and the one who received the promise. Instead, he offers Lot the first choice of land. Lot observes the region and chooses the Jordan Valley, described as well-watered and fertile, like the garden of the Lord in the land of Egypt. This description matters because it highlights the immediate advantage of the area. From a practical perspective, Lot selects the land that appears most beneficial for sustaining his livestock and expanding his wealth. However, the text also notes that this region includes cities such as Sodom, where the inhabitants are described as wicked. This introduces a factor that is not immediately visible in terms of resources, but becomes significant later. Abram, in contrast, remains in the land of Canaan. At these days, his position may appear less advantageous in terms of visible resources. However, the narrative shifts to reaffirm the promise given to him. After Lot separates, God speaks to Abram again, telling him to look in every direction, north, south, east, and west on, stating that all the land he sees will be given to him and his descendants. This matters because it confirms that the promise is not dependent on immediate possession or a visible advantage. It is defined by a future outcome rather than present condition. The promise is expanded further. Abram is told that his offspring will be as numerous as the dust of the earth, an image used to communicate an uncountable number. This is significant because it directly addresses the earlier tension regarding Sarai's barrenness. The statement does not explain how the outcome will occur, but it reinforces that the initial condition does not limit the final result. This matters because it continues the pattern of promise existing alongside unresolved circumstances. Abram is then instructed to walk through the land, to move across its length and breadth. This action is symbolic and practical at the same time. It does not transfer ownership in a legal sense, but it reinforces awareness and connection to the territory described in the promise. Abram responds by relocating his dwelling to Hebron, where he builds another altar. This continues the established pattern of marking significant moments with physical acts of acknowledgement. At this point, the separation between Abram and Lot has defined two distinct paths. Lot has chosen a region based on immediate benefit, while Abram remains in a position tied to a long-term promise. The narrative has established contrast without immediate resolution, setting up future developments that will arise from these decisions. The next phase will introduce external conflict involving regional kings, drawing Abram into a situation that tests his position and expands his role beyond his immediate household. Following the separation between Abram and Lot, the narrative introduces a broader regional conflict that extends beyond family dynamics and local resource disputes. This shift matters because it places Abram within a larger political and military context, showing that his role is not limited to internal decisions, but is now connected to events affecting multiple groups and territories. The account describes a coalition of kings who had previously ruled over several cities in the Jordan region, including Sodom and Gomorrah. After years of subjugation, these cities rebel against their overlords, triggering a military response. A group of Eastern kings advances into the region, defeating various local populations as they move forward. This sequence is presented in a structured way, listing territories and outcomes, which matters because it establishes the scale of the conflict. This is not an isolated skirmish, but a coordinated campaign affecting multiple areas. As the invading forces reach the cities of the plain, including Sodom, they engage in battle and defeat the local kings. The result is the capture of goods, resources, and people. Among those taken is Lot, who had settled in Sodom after choosing the Jordan Valley. This detail connects the earlier decision made by Lot to the present situation. His choice of location now places him directly in the path of conflict, resulting in his capture. This matters because it demonstrates how earlier decisions influence later outcomes in a direct and practical way. When Abram receives news that his nephew has been taken, his response is immediate. He organizes a group of trained men from his household, 318 in total, and sets out in pursuit of the invading forces. This action is significant because it shows Abram taking on a role that goes beyond that of a herdsman or trader. He acts with strategic intent, assembling a force and initiating a targeted response. This matters because it expands his profile within the narrative, showing capability in leadership and action under pressure. Abram's approach involves dividing his forces and attacking at night. This tactic suggests planning and awareness of how to engage a larger or more established enemy. The outcome is successful. Abram defeats the invading group, recovers the captured goods, and brings back Lot, along with the other people who had been taken. This matters because it demonstrates that Abram's intervention is effective, not symbolic. He alters the outcome of the conflict through direct action. Upon returning, Abram is met by two figures, the king of Sodom and king of Salem. Melchizedek is described as a priest of God Most High, and he brings bread and wine, blessing Abram and acknowledging his success as enabled by God. This encounter is brief but important. It introduces a figure associated with both kingship and priesthood, and it frames Abram's victory within a larger context of recognition and acknowledgement. Abram responds by giving Melchizedek a tenth of everything, establishing a pattern of offering tied to success. The king of Sodom then offers Abram the recovered goods, asking only for the return of the people. Abram refuses to take anything beyond what his men have already used, stating that he does not want the king of Sodom to claim that he has made Abram rich. This decision matters because it reflects a deliberate separation between Abram's position and external sources of gain. He chooses not to tie his success or future prosperity to the outcome of this conflict, maintaining independence from the local power structure. At this stage, Abram has moved from receiving a promise to acting within complex situations that involve risk, leadership, and external recognition. The promise remains unfulfilled in terms of descendants and land ownership, but his position is becoming more defined through action and decision. The next phase will address a critical development, the reaffirmation of the promise in a more formal way, including a covenant that introduces new elements and clarifies how the future outcome will unfold. Act 6, the covenant and the question of fulfillment. After the events involving the regional conflict and Abram's successful intervention, the narrative returns to the central issue that has remained unresolved since the beginning of his journey: the promise of descendants. Up to this point, Abram has received repeated assurances regarding land and future generations, but no direct progress has been made in terms of having a child. This matters because it creates a sustained tension between what has been promised and what is currently observable. At this stage, the text introduces a new form of communication. It states that the word of the Lord comes to Abram in a vision. This is significant because it marks a shift from external events to a more direct and personal interaction. The message begins with reassurance. Abram is told not to fear, and that he will be protected and greatly rewarded. This matters because it addresses both his recent involvement in conflict and the broader uncertainty surrounding his future. Abram responds with the question that brings the central issue into focus. He acknowledges the promise of reward, but points out that he remains without a child. He identifies his current heir as Eliezer of Damascus, a servant within his household. This response is important because it shows Abram interpreting his situation based on existing conditions. Without a biological heir, inheritance would naturally pass to someone within his extended household. This matters because it highlights the gap between the promise and the present reality. In response, a clarification is given. Abram is told that this servant will not be his heir, but that a son coming from his own body will inherit what has been promised. This statement is direct and removes ambiguity. It defines the fulfillment of the promise in specific terms, biological descent, rather than household arrangement. This matters because it narrows the scope of expectation and establishes a clear condition for what is to come. To reinforce this statement, Abram is brought outside and told to look toward the sky and count the stars. If he is able to do so, he is then told that his offspring will be like the stars in number. This comparison serves as a visual reference rather than a symbolic abstraction. It provides a scale that is beyond immediate calculation. This matters because it contrasts sharply with Abram's current situation, where there is no child at all. The gap between 0 and an uncountable number is emphasized. The narrative then records Abram's response in a concise but significant statement. He believes the Lord, and it is counted to him as righteousness. This matters because it introduces a new element to us in the promise despite the absence of visible evidence. The focus is not on action at this moment, but on acceptance of what has been stated. Following this, the promise is expanded to include land once again. Abram is told that he has been brought out of Ur to be given this land as a possession. Abram then asks a practical question. How will he know that he will possess it? This question shifts the focus from descendants to territory and introduces the need for confirmation. In response, a specific set of instructions is given involving animals: a heifer, a goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon. Abram prepares these as directed, cutting the larger animals in half and arranging them opposite each other. This setup is significant because it aligns with known practices of covenant making in the ancient context, where agreements were formalized through ritual actions. This matters because it indicates that what follows will not be a general promise, but a structured and binding declaration. At this point, the elements for a formal covenant are in place, but the process is not yet complete. The next phase will describe how this covenant is established, what it includes, and how it addresses both the promise of land and the timeline for its fulfillment. With the animals prepared and arranged, the narrative moves into the formalization of the covenant. Abram places the divided pieces opposite each other, creating a path between them. This setup reflects a known practice in ancient agreements, where parties would pass between divided animals. As a sign of commitment, the implication of such a ritual is serious. It symbolizes that the terms of the agreement are binding. This matters because it shows that what is about to occur is not an informal reassurance, but a structured and deliberate covenant. Before the covenant is completed, the text introduces an interruption. Birds of prey come down on the carcasses, and Abram drives them away. This detail may seem minor, but it matters because it shows Abram actively maintaining the prepared space. The interruption does not stop the process, but it delays it. This moment reinforces that the covenant is not rushed. It unfolds with intentional timing. As the sun begins to set, Abram falls into a deep sleep, and a sense of dread and darkness comes upon him. This transition is important because it shifts the scene from physical preparation to a more controlled and directed experience. The covenant is not enacted through Abram's active participation alone, but through a process that involves him in a different state. This matters because it highlights that the fulfillment of the promise will not depend solely on Abram's actions. During this state, a message is delivered that introduces a timeline. Abram is told that his descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. This statement is significant because it adds a long-term perspective to the promise. Up to this point, the focus has been on future blessing and expansion. Now, a period of hardship is included as part of that process. This matters because it clarifies that the path to fulfillment will not be immediate or uninterrupted. The message continues by stating that the nation responsible for this oppression will eventually be judged, and that Abram's descendants will come out with great possessions. This introduces a sequence. Entry into a foreign land, a period of oppression, followed by release and increase. This matters because it defines the process in stages rather than presenting the outcome without context. It also connects Abram's future line to events that will occur long after his lifetime. Abram himself is given a different outcome. He is told that he will go to his ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. This detail separates Abram's personal experience from the longer timeline of his descendants. It matters because it shows that the full realization of the promise extends beyond a single lifetime. Abram will not see all aspects of fulfillment directly, but he is positioned at the beginning of the process. Another important element is introduced regarding the timing of possession of the land. It is stated that Abram's descendants will return to this land in the 4th generation, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. This matters because it connects the timeline not only to Abram's lineage, but also to the condition of the current inhabitants of the land. The delay is not arbitrary. It is tied to factors beyond Abram's immediate situation. After these statements, the covenant is enacted in a distinct way. When darkness has fully set in, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch pass between the pieces of the animals. This action is central to the covenant process. Unlike typical agreements where both parties pass through, here the movement is represented symbolically. This matters because it indicates that the fulfillment of the covenant is not dependent on mutual obligation in the same way as a standard agreement. The emphasis is placed on the authority establishing the covenant rather than on Abram's role in maintaining it. Following this, the terms of the covenant are stated clearly. The land is defined in geographical terms, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. Specific groups currently inhabiting the land are listed, reinforcing that this is a real and occupied territory. This matters because it grounds the promise in identifiable locations rather than abstract space. At these states, the covenant has been formally established, including a defined lineage, a timeline involving both hardship and expansion, and a specific territory. The promise now has structure, but the immediate condition remains. Unchanged. Abram still has no child. The next phase will address how Abram and Sarai respond to this ongoing delay, introducing a decision that attempts to resolve the situation through human initiative rather than waiting for the process to unfold as described. After the covenant is established and the timeline clarified, the narrative returns to the immediate reality of Abram and Sarai's situation. Despite the detailed promises and the formal agreement, there is still no child. Time continues to pass, and the absence of visible progress becomes more difficult to reconcile with what has been declared. This matters because it creates pressure to act. The longer the delay continues, the more the promise appears disconnected from present circumstances. At these points, Sarai introduces a proposal intended to address the situation. She suggests that Abram have a child through her servant Hagar, an Egyptian woman. This approach reflects a known practice in the ancient context, where a servant could bear a child on behalf of a wife who was unable to do so. From a practical standpoint, this solution aligns with existing social structures. This matters because it shows an attempt to fulfill the promise using available means, rather than waiting for a change in the current condition. Abram agrees to Sarai's proposal, and Hagar becomes pregnant. The outcome is immediate, but it introduces new complications. As soon as Hagar realizes that she is pregnant, her attitude toward Sarai changes. The text indicates that Sarai is then viewed with less respect. This shift matters because it disrupts the existing relationship within the household. What began as a solution to one problem creates another, altering the balance between individuals. Sarai responds by confronting Abram, holding him responsible for the situation. Abram, in turn, allows Sarai to deal with Hagar as she sees fit. Sarai treats Hagar harshly, leading Hagar to flee into the wilderness. This sequence of events is important because it demonstrates how a decision made to resolve tension can generate additional conflict. The outcome extends beyond the initial goal and affects multiple relationships within the household. While Hagar is in the wilderness, the narrative introduces a new development. An angel of the Lord finds her near a spring of water and speaks to her directly. This interaction is significant because it extends attention beyond Abram and Sarai to someone outside the central line. Hagar is instructed to return and submit to Sarai. but she is also given a promise. She will have a son, and his descendants will be numerous. This matters because it shows that the consequences of the earlier decision are acknowledged and incorporated into the broader narrative, rather than ignored. Hagar is told to name her son Ishmael, meaning God hears, because her situation has been recognized. The description of Ishmael's future includes independence and conflict, indicating that his line will exist alongside, but distinct from, the line of promise. This matters because it introduces a parallel development, one that originates from human initiative, rather than the direct fulfillment of the original promise. Hagar returns and gives birth to Ishmael, and Abram is 86 years old at this point. This detail provides a clear marker in the timeline. It shows that years have passed since the initial promise was given, and that the current outcome has been achieved through an alternative path. However, the narrative does not present Ishmael as the fulfillment of the original promise. The distinction remains, even though a child has now been born. At Stasi, the situation is more complex than before. Abram now has a son, but the terms of the covenant specifically, a child through Sarai, have not yet been fulfilled. The attempt to resolve the delay has introduced new relationships and future developments, but it has not replaced the original promise. The next phase will address how the covenant is reaffirmed and expanded, including new instructions and a direct resolution to the question of lineage that has remained open since the beginning of Abram's journey. After the birth of Ishmael, the narrative introduces a significant passage of time before the next development occurs. 13 years pass without recorded events related to the promise. Abram is now 99 years old when the next direct communication takes place. This gap matters because it emphasizes the extended delay between the initial promise and its fulfillment. It reinforces that the process is not immediate and that long periods of apparent inactivity can exist within the broader timeline. At this point, God appears to Abram again and reaffirms the covenant, but with additional clarity and new elements. The message begins with a directive. Abram is to walk before God and be blameless. This instruction focuses on conduct and alignment, indicating that the relationship involves both promise and expectation. This matters because it introduces a defined standard of behavior alongside the assurances already given. A change of identity is then established. Abram's name is changed to Abraham, meaning father of many nations. This is not symbolic alone, it reflects the role he is expected to fulfill. Sarah's name is also changed to Sarah. These changes matter because they formalize the transition from current condition to future identity. The names themselves serve as ongoing reminders of the promise, even before it is visibly realized. The covenant is expanded to include not just a single lineage, but multiple nations. Abraham is told that kings will come from him, and that the covenant will extend to his descendants as an everlasting agreement. This matters because it broadens the scope of the promise beyond a single outcome. It includes long-term continuity, leadership, and structured development across generations. A physical sign of the covenant is then introduced: circumcision. Every male in Abraham's household and among his descendants is to undergo this act as a marker of participation in the covenant. This requirement applies not only to biological descendants, but also to those within the household, including servants. This matters because it establishes a visible and ongoing identifier. Unlike earlier signs, this one is directly tied to the people themselves and is maintained across generations. At this stage, the central issue of a child through Sarah is addressed directly. God states that Sarah will bear a son, and that this son will be the one through whom the covenant will be established. Abraham responds by falling face down and laughing, questioning how a child could be born to him at nearly 100 years old, and to Sarah at 90. This reaction matters because it reflects the continued tension between promise and physical reality. Even with repeated assurances, the biological limitations remain evident. Abraham mentions Ishmael, expressing a desire for him to fulfill the promise. However, the response is clear. Sarah will bear a son, and his name will be Isaac. The covenant will be established through him, not Ishmael. This distinction is critical because it separates the outcome of human initiative from the original promise. Ishmael is acknowledged and will become a great nation, But he is not the line through which the covenant continues. The timing is also specified. The birth of Isaac will occur within a defined period about a year from this point. This matters because it introduces a measurable expectation. For the first time, the fulfillment of the promise is not left open. It is placed within a specific time frame, reducing uncertainty and marking the transition from long-term anticipation to immediate expectation. Following this, Abraham carries out the instruction regarding circumcision on the same day, applying it to himself, Ishmael, and every male in his household. This immediate action reinforces the pattern seen throughout the narrative. When given instruction, Abraham responds without delay. It also formalizes the covenant in a tangible way within his community. At this point, all elements are in place for the fulfillment of the promise. The lineage has been clarified. The covenant has been formalized with a sign. Identities have been redefined, and a specific time frame has been given. The next phase will move from promise to realization, focusing on the events leading up to the birth of Isaac and the confirmation of what has been established. Act 7, the fulfillment begins. Isaac and the turning point. With the covenant reaffirmed, the names changed, and a defined time frame established, the narrative moves into the final stage before fulfillment. For the first time since the original promise, the expectation is no longer open-ended. A specific period has been set, and the focus shifts toward events that confirm what has been stated. This matters because it transitions the narrative from long-term anticipation into immediate progression. Shortly after this, a new development occurs. The text describes 3 men appearing near Abraham while he is sitting at the entrance of his tent during the heat of the day. Abraham recognizes the importance of the moment and responds with urgency, inviting them to rest and offering hospitality. This interaction is significant because it introduces a direct encounter that carries forward the promise. The presence of these visitors is not random. It serves as a continuation of the communication already established. Abraham prepares a meal, involving Sarah in the process, and ensures that the visitors are served properly. This matters because it reflects established cultural practices of hospitality, but it also creates the setting for the next statement. During this interaction, one of the visitors announces that Sarah will have a son within the specified time frame by the next year. This repeats the earlier declaration, but now in a more immediate and personal context. Sarah, listening from inside the tent, reacts internally. The text states that she laughs to herself, questioning how such an outcome could occur given her age and physical condition. This reaction matters because it mirrors Abraham's earlier response, highlighting the continued gap between the promise and what seems physically possible. The narrative does not present this as disbelief alone, but as a response grounded in observable reality. The response to Sarah's reaction is direct. The question is asked, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" This statement shifts the focus away from human limitation and back to the authority behind the promise. It reinforces that the fulfillment is not dependent on natural conditions alone. This matters because it addresses the central tension that has been present throughout the narrative. Following this interaction, the visitors prepare to leave, and the narrative introduces a secondary development involving the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. While this event is not directly tied to the birth of Isaac, it is connected to the broader context of Abraham's role. The situation in these cities is described as serious, with the wrongdoing identified as extensive. This matters because it parallels earlier patterns seen before the flood, where widespread corruption leads to direct intervention. Abraham becomes aware of what is about to occur and engages in a dialogue regarding the fate of these cities. He asks whether the cities would be spared if a certain number of righteous individuals were found within them. This exchange is structured with Abraham presenting decreasing numbers and receiving confirmation that the cities would be spared at each level if that number of righteous people were present. This matters because it shows Abraham taking on a role of intercession, advocating for the possibility of preservation within a situation of judgment. The dialogue ends with a minimum threshold, below which the cities will not be spared. This establishes that the condition within Sodom and Gomorrah has reached a point where continuation is no longer viable unless a basic standard is met. The narrative then shifts away from Abraham and toward the cities themselves, preparing to show how the situation unfolds. At this stage, the promise of Isaac remains in place with a defined time frame. While a parallel event involving Sodom and Gomorrah begins to develop, the next phase will focus on how that situation is resolved, including the involvement of Lot and the consequences that follow. As the focus shifts from Abraham to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, the narrative follows the two visitors who arrive at Sodom in the evening. Lot is sitting at the gate of the city, a position that suggests involvement in local affairs or leadership. When he sees them, he resists to meet them and insists that they stay at his house rather than remain in the open square. This matters because it mirrors the earlier hospitality shown by Abraham, but now within a different environment. Already identified as corrupt, Lot prepares a meal and hosts the visitors, but the situation quickly escalates. Before they lie down, men from the city surround the house, demanding that the visitors be brought out. The text presents this as a collective action, involving both young and old. This matters because it confirms the earlier assessment of widespread corruption within the city. The issue is not isolated to a few individuals, but reflects a broader condition. Lot attempts to intervene, stepping outside and appealing to the crowd not to act in this way. His response includes an attempt to protect the visitors, but it also introduces a proposal that reflects the severity of the situation. The crowd rejects his appeal and begins to press against him, indicating that the situation is moving toward violence. This matters because it shows that the environment within the city has reached a point where order and restraint are no longer effective. At this moment, the visitors act directly. They pull Lot back into the house and strike the men outside with blindness, preventing them from finding the door. This intervention is immediate and targeted. It matters because it halts the escalation and demonstrates that the situation is beyond human resolution. The visitors then inform Lot that the city is about to be destroyed and instruct him to gather any relatives and leave. Lot attempts to warn his sons-in-law, but they dismiss his words as if he were joking. This response is important because it shows a lack of recognition of the seriousness of the situation. The warning is given, but not accepted. This matters because it reflects a pattern seen earlier in the narrative. Opportunity for response exists, but it is not always taken. As morning approaches, the urgency increases. The visitors instruct Lot, his wife, and his two daughters to leave immediately. When Lot hesitates, they take hold of his hand and lead him out of the city. This detail is significant because it shows that even at this stage, decisive action is required to ensure escape. The instruction is clear. They are to flee without looking back, and not to stop anywhere in the plain. Lot negotiates a modification to the plan, asking to take refuge in a nearby small town instead of the mountains. This request is granted, and he is allowed to go to the town of Zoar. This matters because it shows flexibility within the directive, but the core requirement remains unchanged. He must leave the area designated for destruction. As soon as Lot reaches safety, the destruction begins. Fire and sulfur rain down on Sodom and Gomorrah, overthrowing the cities and the surrounding region. The description is direct and emphasizes total destruction. This matters because it aligns with the earlier pattern of judgment seen in the flood, though on a localized scale. During the escape, Lot's wife looks back and becomes a pillar of salt. This moment is brief, but significant. The instruction not to look back is clear, and the consequence for ignoring it is immediate. This matters because it reinforces the importance of adherence to the directive. During critical moments, after the destruction, Abraham observes the area from a distance and sees the smoke rising from the land. This confirms the outcome of the event. The narrative also notes that God remembered Abraham and brought Lot out of the disaster, connecting the rescue back to the earlier dialogue between Abraham and the visitors. At this task, the situation involving Sodom and Gomorrah has been resolved. The focus now returns to Abraham and Sarah, where the timeline for the birth of Isaac is approaching its completion. With the events in Sodom concluded and the timeline for the promise still in place, the narrative returns to Abraham and Sarah. The focus now shifts back to the central issue that has been building since the beginning of Abram's journey, the birth of a son through Sarah. At this point, the time frame that was previously specified is reached, and the narrative records the fulfillment in direct terms. The Lord visits Sarah, as had been said, and she conceives and bears a son to Abraham in his old age. This matters because it marks the transition from promise to realization, confirming that the earlier declarations were not conditional on human capacity. The child is named Isaac. As instructed, the name itself is connected to the earlier reactions of both Abraham and Sarah, who had laughed when the promise was first stated. This matters because the name serves as a reminder of the initial response and the outcome that followed. It ties together the period of doubt and the eventual fulfillment into a single reference point that will remain with the family moving forward. Abraham follows the covenant instruction by circumcising Isaac on the 8th day. This action is consistent with the directive established earlier and shows that the covenant is being applied to the next generation immediately. This matters because it reinforces continuity. The covenant is not limited to Abraham himself, but extends through his descendants beginning with Isaac. Sarah's response to the birth is also recorded. She acknowledges the unexpected nature of the event, stating that God has made laughter for her and that others will share in that response. This reflects a shift from earlier skepticism to recognition of what has occurred. This matters because it closes the gap between expectation and reality. What had seemed unlikely is now observable, and the response adjusts accordingly. As Isaac grows, another development arises involving Ishmael, the son of Hagar. The text describes an incident during a feast held when Isaac is weaned, where Ishmael is observed interacting in a way that leads Sarah to demand that Hagar and her son be sent away. This request is significant because it introduces tension between the two lines, one resulting from the original promise and the other from the earlier attempt to resolve the delay. Sarah's concern is that Ishmael will share in the inheritance intended for Isaac. Abraham is troubled by this situation, particularly because it involves his son. This matters because it shows a personal conflict between emotional attachment and the structure of the promise. The resolution comes through instruction. Abraham is told to listen to Sarah, with the clarification that the line of promise will continue through Isaac. At the same time, it is stated that Ishmael will also become a nation, acknowledging his place without equating it to the covenant line. Abraham acts on this instruction by providing Hagar with provisions and sending her away with Ishmael. This action marks a separation between the two lines. While both will continue, they will do so independently. This matters because it defines the structure moving forward, ensuring that the fulfillment of the promise remains clearly associated with Isaac. Hagar and Ishmael travel into the wilderness, where their situation becomes critical due to lack of water. At a point of distress, Hagar distances herself, unable to watch what she believes will be the death of her son. This moment reflects the severity of their condition. However, intervention occurs again. God hears the boy and directs Hagar to a source of water, preserving their lives. This matters because it confirms that, although Ishmael is not the line of the covenant, he is not abandoned. His future as a nation remains intact. At this stage, Isaac has been born. The covenant line is established, and the separation between Isaac and Ishmael has been defined. The promise that began with Abram has now taken its first concrete form. The next phase will address a final test involving Isaac, which will further define the nature of Abraham's role and the depth of the commitment required. With Isaac born and the line of the covenant clearly established, the narrative introduces a final event that tests the entire structure of what has been built so far. This moment is presented not as a continuation of external conflict, but as a direct instruction that challenges the core of the promise itself. After everything that has taken place, the call, the covenant, the delay, and the fulfillment of focus now turns to a situation that places Isaac at the center of a new decision. The instruction is direct. Abraham is told to take Isaac, his son, whom he loves, and go to a specific region where he is to offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain that will be shown to him. This command is significant because it appears to conflict with the promise that Isaac is the one through whom the covenant will continue. This matters because it creates a direct tension between what has been established and what is now being required. The narrative does not provide an explanation at this point. It presents the instruction and records Abraham's response. Abraham acts immediately. He rises early, prepares what is needed, and begins the journey with Isaac and two servants. The text emphasizes preparation and movement without hesitation. This matters because it continues the pattern seen throughout his story when given instruction. Abraham responds with action rather than delay. The journey lasts several days, indicating that this is not a momentary decision, but one sustained over time. As they approach the location, Abraham leaves the servants behind and continues with Isaac alone. He carries the materials for the offering, while Isaac carries the wood. During the ascent, Isaac asks a question that highlights the situation. The fire and wood are present, but where is the lamb for the offering? Abraham responds that God will provide the lamb. This exchange matters because it reflects both awareness of the situation and a response that does not fully disclose the immediate plan, while still aligning with the expectation that provision will occur. When they reach the designated place, Abraham builds an altar and arranges the wood. He then binds Isaac and places him on the altar. The narrative presents these actions in sequence, without commentary, focusing on the progression rather than interpretation. This matters because it shows the extent to which Abraham follows the instruction, even when it involves the very element through which the promise is supposed to continue. At the moment when Abraham extends his hand to carry out the act, the sequence is interrupted. An angel of the Lord calls to him, instructing him not to harm the boy. The statement clarifies that the purpose of the event has been fulfilled. Abraham has demonstrated that he does not withhold what has been given, even when it is central to the promise. This matters because it defines the event as a test rather than an outcome. Immediately following this, a ram is seen caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham takes the ram and offers it in place of Isaac. This substitution is significant because it resolves the situation without contradicting the promise. Isaac remains alive, and the offering is completed through an alternative provided at the necessary moment. This matters because it reinforces the earlier statement that provision would be made. After this, the promise is reaffirmed once more. Abraham is told that because of his action, his descendants will be multiplied, and that through his offspring, all nations of the earth will be blessed. This repetition is important because it confirms that the covenant remains intact and is now reinforced by this event. Abraham returns with Isaac, and they go back together. The narrative closes this phase by re-establishing normal movement after a moment of intense testing. The promise that began with a call has now been fulfilled in part through Isaac, tested under direct challenge, and reaffirmed with expanded clarity. At this stage, all key elements have been established. The condition of the world before the flood, the judgment that followed, the preservation through Noah, the reestablishment of humanity, and the formation of a specific covenant line through Abraham and Isaac. The final phase will draw these elements together, providing a clear conclusion based on the sequence of events and their outcomes. Act 8. What this sequence actually shows. After following the full sequence from the condition of the world before the flood to the establishment of the covenant line, through Abraham and Isaac, the narrative presents a consistent pattern that can be traced across each stage. The events are not isolated. They are connected through cause and consequence, with each phase building directly on what came before. This matters because it allows the account to be understood as a structured progression rather than a collection of separate stories. The first pattern is the relationship between human behavior and outcome. Before the flood, the text describes a sustained condition of corruption and violence that leads to a defined intervention. The flood itself is not introduced without context. It follows a clear assessment of the state of the world. After the flood, a framework is established to address that same issue, moving forward and introducing accountability and defined limits. This matters because it shows that the events are not random, but tied to observable conditions and responses. The second pattern is the role of instruction, followed by response. Noah receives detailed directions and follows them without deviation, resulting in survival during a global event. Abraham receives instruction to leave, to act, and to trust a process that unfolds over time. In both cases, the outcome is connected to adherence to what is given. This matters because it highlights a consistent structure. Direction is provided, and the response determines how the situation develops. A third element is the presence of delay between promise and fulfillment. Noah builds the ark over an extended period before the flood begins. Abraham receives the promise of a son many years before Isaac is born. In both cases, the timeline includes long intervals where no visible progress occurs. This matters because it shows that the narrative includes extended phases where the outcome is not immediately apparent, but the process continues toward a defined result. Another consistent feature is the introduction of human decisions that complicate the process. Before the flood, society as a whole moves toward corruption. In Abraham's case, decisions such as going to Egypt or having a child through Hagar create additional layers that must be addressed. These actions do not stop the overall progression, but they affect how it unfolds. This matters because it shows that individual choices operate within the broader structure without replacing it. The narrative also emphasizes the distinction between general humanity and a specific line through which events continue. After the flood, all nations spread across the earth, but the focus narrows to Abraham and his descendants. This matters because it defines how the story progresses from global conditions to a targeted lineage that carries forward the next phase. Finally, the sequence demonstrates that fulfillment often includes testing. The instruction involving Isaac places the promise under direct challenge, but the outcome reinforces rather than cancels what was established. This matters because it shows that confirmation of the promise includes moments where its continuation appears uncertain, but is ultimately preserved. Taken together, these elements form a structured sequence: condition, instruction, response, delay, complication, and fulfillment. Each stage leads into the next without breaking continuity. The account does not present these events as abstract lessons, but as a recorded progression with defined steps and outcomes. If you followed this entire breakdown, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more full-length, step-by-step narratives like this. And before you go, leave a comment. Where are you watching from? What time is it there right now? And in your view, what was the most decisive turning point in this entire sequence from Noah to Abraham? This concludes the full account of what happened, step by step, from the days of Noah to the beginning of the covenant line through Abraham and Isaac.